Well, tonight, Father Colum asked me to speak on hope, but especially on St. Therese and what it means in our modern time, and what it means especially in relationship to despair and discouragement. I'd like to read something from the new biography of Robert Mapplethorpe, the photographer, who is as far from St. Therese as you could imagine, in his lifestyle especially, and yet who, like her, is a baptized Catholic, received First Holy Communion and all of that, but very, very, very far from St. Therese. And he died of AIDS, and this is part of the sermon that the priest preached at his sermon. There is a dark side to the human soul that is filled with conflict and torment. But can you all hear me easily? Yes. And if at any time you can't, just put up your hand, without any fear or shame. Just if you can't hear me easily. Okay. Oh, Ruth. Hi, Ben. Okay. So I'll begin. There is a dark side to the human soul that is filled with conflict and torment. It is a side of the human soul that few people are brave enough to explore. Some poets like Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and Blake have tried. The novelist Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness presented Marlowe and Mr. Kurtz looking around at the chaos and devastation they saw and exclaiming 4 words, the horror, the horror. And then he went on, showing how Mapplethorpe had explored that evil, in his own heart and in the society. Then he finished up the sermon. We need to believe in a God who is good and gracious and merciful, especially in the dark moments of life. No one who comes to me will I ever reject. Because of that promise, we trust that when Robert went through the gates of death and stood before the judgment seat of God, Jesus opened his arms and welcomed Robert home. It was very, very beautiful. Now, when we talk about hope and despair, and in the modern world, we can get into a very pessimistic attitude and become prophets of doom and of gloom. The end is near. That sign. Father Colum has a sign in his office that says, the end is not near. You better start learning to cope. This age we are in is really an extraordinary age. This is a great time to be alive. You think of the advances in medicine, the existence of the United Nations even, the concern for the handicapped, for the mentally ill, for indigenous people, for the environment. We've seen in our time the collapse of totalitarianism, like of Nazism, fascism, and communism. We've seen more in our present time, and possibly a lot of this due to the present Holy Father, but a growth of respect for religious freedom. We see things like the independence that many elderly have here in the States, and we see the developments of women's rights. We see a bond in the whole the world through TV and computers. We see the enthusiasm of youth that you see manifested at certain times. And an age that can produce a Mother Teresa or, Rigoberta Menchú and Nelson Mandela. It's a wonderful time. And yet there are many troubles in our time. There are great fears and often much anxieties abroad. In the October 1st issue of America, they went through a list of the mess that we're in. And it did it actually in 2 different parts. And if we just look around or read the newspaper or watch the news on TV, you see Bosnia and Rwanda. altogether mentioning like our own experiences, but things like gang warfare and murder. I remember Father John Cornelius in Seattle. I remember one time I was with a group of priests, and we asked him, what was the biggest problem in his parish? He said, we're losing our youth. Well, that happens everywhere. Oh, no, he said, we're losing them. He said, they are dying from AIDS, from drug overdoses, and from gang warfare. It didn't mean that they're not going to catechism. We are losing them. They are dying. A whole generation has been wiped out. And that was kind of a big, big shock. We see the problem of AIDS, obviously, of drugs, even in our own sweet little Stanwood. The extraordinary amount of out-of-wedlock pregnancy, the violence, the crime, as we discovered even yesterday, the terrorism, child abuse, spouse abuse, what they call the deadbeat fathers, and as became very evident recently, the racism. When you think of people like Madonna, another good Catholic girl, the whole sense of materialism and sexual irresponsibility, consumerism and waste, and then of course abortion, euthanasia, arms sales, and then the stupidity of France, what they're doing in this Southern Pacific. And maybe even like looking at the church, there's an element of division within the church. And in our nation, the distrust of government. So, you know, things are not all well, and some people are very anxious. Some people are very, very worried. You know, where are we going? Are all of these rooted in a moral crisis? Have our values gone astray? And are we putting wrong priorities? Is there a great fear of the future? I believe this is the first generation of Americans, certainly in a long, long time, where the prospects for the next generation are worse than for the present generation. It's a very unique experience in American history. And people are very frightened of that. So, in many, there is despair and disgust and distrust, and that can tragically show itself in the suicides. You see that like even among the young. That's very, very frightening aspect of our present time. So I think we can sum it up though by saying, like with Dickens, it's the best of times, extraordinary time to be alive, and in some ways it's the worst of times. And there's no easy solution. So what we'd like to do tonight is to look at Saint Therese of Lisieux, because she is a foundational saint of the church of our time. She's a pioneer at the beginning of this century whose life and insights came to full fruition, or maybe not full fruition, but certainly to fruition in Vatican II. So much of what happened in that council, so much of what happened for good, can be traced back to Saint Therese, see, who gave a way of living the gospel, who gave to the church a new spirituality. See, and as people live the spirituality, then all the others flow from that and reflecting on it. So she's an extraordinarily important person for understanding the modern church and the church in which we are living in now and of which we are part. Now, I'm sure most of you know who I'm talking about. Some of you might think, well, is this the Therese of Avila, or who is Saint Therese? It's extraordinary how people still get them confused. So I'll just give you a very brief little outline. She was born in Alençon. She's a Norman, and you can find that very down-to-earth, but tough Norman spirit in her. You know, like William the Conqueror was a Norman, and they're descended from the Norsemen, so they should make her feel very much at home in this area. But she has that adventuresomeness and that toughness, but that real sense of the real and down-to-earthness about her. She was born in 1873, the last of 9 children, 4 of whom died as little children. Her father was a jeweler and a watchmaker, and her mother was a lace maker who was very successful and had her own business. She was like manager of 20 employees in her own business. In fact, she was so successful, her husband sold his shop, and he was like a master jeweler, and sold his shop to work for her. But anyway, Therese was her last baby, her 9th, and Therese was very ill as a little baby and had to be sent out to a wet nurse out in the country. So Therese, from the very beginning, she was separated from her mother and got a new mother. Then after about 1.5 years, she came back and kind of bonded again with her real mother. But then, unfortunately, her mother died of breast cancer when Therese was 3.5. The family was, like good, solid, Norman, devout, Catholic family of the time. So after the mother died, the family moved up to Lisieux, which is a small enough town, but in Normandy too. Now here's this young girl who just shortly after her birth, when she was 2 months old, was broken from her mother and came out to this woman, Rose. Then that bond was broken. And she came back. Then the mother died. Then when they came up to Lisieux, she made Pauline, her sister, like to be her mother. And then Pauline, without telling her, then left and went away to be a Carmelite nun. And here was that whole mother relationship smashed again. And she went into a very frightened time of her life. She calls it the saddest time of her life. Really becoming very, the books like say neurotic. And it's interesting, when she went to school, she says, most people say that school days are the happiest days of your life. She says, for me, they were the worst, the saddest. She hated school. And in fact, she didn't even finish grammar school. She came home, then was kind of homeschooled. But very frightened, kind of wrapped up in herself. She only felt comfortable with the family. The joyful times were, again, a woman of very deep faith and kind of like a co-naturality with matters of faith. Like her first Holy Communion, her confirmation. These were the great, great moments. Now, when she was about 13, in her 13th, just, at that stage in her life, she had what you call a conversion. And she'd been very, touchy, and she'd cry if people looked at her. Then she cried because she cried, and very, 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 and a terrible time of scruples, Someone would give her a lovely blue bow for her hair, and she'd feel so beautiful. And then she'd have to run to confession before she'd go to communion. She went through a very, very, very troubled, very hard time, all that. Between her mother's death and time for what she called conversion. In fact, one time things got so bad that she nearly did die. And, she was seeing all weird things and strange things, and really almost like on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Although during all, her mind is clear, and she's kind of looking at what's going on to herself. That part of her mind never broke. But anyway, with the conversion, it was a very simple thing. It was at Christmas. And they came back from Mass at the cathedral, and they had for Santa Claus presents outside. And her father said, "Oh, thank God this is the last time we're going to have this nonsense." You see, and Therese was just going to cry. But she didn't. She said, she'd just come back from Mass, Jesus had changed me. And she rushed down and threw her arms around her father and was joyful, picked up the toys, and then things got better again. She said, Jesus had changed me. she was no longer, she didn't think of herself at that moment, you know, and she was going to start crying and all that. She thought of her father. And that was the first time, really, since her mother died, that she was reaching out to think of someone else rather than of herself. And she calls that right through the end of her life. That was her conversion. And you see suddenly a real maturity. You can even see it, there's a little photograph I have there of her, not too long after that time. Like a dignity and a confidence and a sureness comes into her. And at that time then, her heart began to open. She saw a picture of Christ, a little picture on the cross that had fallen out of her missal. And she's realized she wanted to save souls. That was like the phrase of that time. To bring people to Christ and Christ to people. To make Christ loved and to help people love Christ. And the symbolism of it was that like the blood of Christ being wasted. And she wanted to gather it up, you see, and bring that to others. And she got a tremendous desire for helping others. See? And it was out of that she began to realize that the best way for her to do that would be as a contemplative, cloistered Carmelite nun. For her, that's the way she saw it, you see. She saw then about this guy, Pranzini, and it was the O.J. Simpson trial of that time. A man who had very brutally murdered a woman and her daughter and their maid. This happened in Marseille. And all the country was against him. And you know, it was in the papers and everybody was reading it. And it was the same reaction as the, you know, say a year ago at the O.J. Simpson thing. It was very interesting. Her reaction was, I will pray for him. And just before he died, before the guillotine, you know, he kissed the crucifix 3 times. And she read about this. And he was her firstborn. That's the way she felt. He was her first child. And that kind of encouraged her and increased her desire, you see. But see what's happening? It's moving out. You know, her love and her concern is moving, it's growing, it's developing, you see. And then it's through becoming in the cloister that it'll be able to reach out then to the whole church. And then eventually sees through the whole church to the whole world. You know, but there's that kind of breaking down of selfishness and kind of self-centeredness, moving out to others. So eventually anyway, she wanted to become a nun, a Carmelite nun then, and of course she was only 15, under a lot of obstacles, but again, the toughness. If she sets her mind on something, nothing will stop her. And the priest said no, said okay, she went to the bishop, and the bishop said no, okay, she went to the Pope. Of course, the Pope was wise Italian, Leo III, tapped her on the head and said, if it's God's will that you enter, you will enter, you see. And remember, I think I told some of you what Therese said about him. Like he's deaf, he didn't hear what I said. And he's so old anyway, you would think he was dead. She was very, very annoyed. And on that pilgrimage, you know, she was meeting the Pope, you know, that was just kind of a figure. And realized that he was a very compassionate man. You know? And yet, she felt there was a human frailty there. On the trip, she met many priests and found there was a very real frailty there. For about 78 priests. I would never have gone on that pilgrimage. But there were 78 out of about 160 or something like that. You know. And she saw them there, you know, in it, and but she didn't become disillusioned. She said, now I realize, see, these were good priests, and yet how they need prayer. And so she made the holiness of priests part of her life mission, and one of her reasons then for becoming a Carmelite nun. That's one of the wonderful things that we'll see later. You know, that attitude where others would get bittered or sour or so hurt, that she takes a different approach, and reaches out. You see, because she'd learned to reach out from that time for conversion, to look and see good there. So, anyway, then she did eventually enter the Carmel at 15. A few months after she entered, her father had a very serious mental breakdown. And he would disappear. And eventually, because he was disappearing, and he'd get a revolver and keep in his house, thinking that people were invading, to attack his daughter. This was Celine. And they realized, the poor man, that his mind had gone. And he was 3 years in a mental hospital. It's the same time, I have a picture there of Van Gogh, the same time as Van Gogh was in the mental hospital in the south. And it's interesting in terms of despair, how Van Gogh, a great and a very holy man, the pressure of the despair in his life led him to suicide. And that's why I have that painting there. And then this, very famous, the Scream, monks with the Scream, kind of a number of his paintings, there's a few more there, around this time are very dealing with the anxiety of the world. Nietzsche was writing around this time too. And the anxiety and the uncertainty and the fear and the despair that was in the world at that time. And monks did that, or Monk did that famous, the Scream, society, the Scream there. But Louis was in the hospital. Now, here's this young girl of 15. And there's word going around the village, the town. Or the father flipped, when the little girl left him. And she had to carry that burden. But here was the man that she loved more than anyone else. Really the one man in her life. She had 4 sisters, you see. And here he's off in another town, in Caen. He was there for 3 years in the mental hospital. Then eventually he had a serious stroke. And so they knew that he couldn't wander away. So they brought him back to Lisieux, and he came in to visit them. But for Therese, the anguish of that time, she always said that was her great suffering, her great pain. And after he had died, she called him like Father, who was dying, or who had died, for 5 years, the 5 years of death. It was, and at that time, mental illness, the terrible, opprobrium attached to it. Not to mention just her mother's cancer. Her mother died of cancer, But that was the great, great agony. And in that she had to reach out to God, in trust and in love. Because she knew she couldn't handle it on her own. And the one thing that sustained her was the thought of heaven. You see, that her father going through this, that would receive the reward in heaven. Now you can imagine then later on, when she went through her agony and the temptations against the existence of heaven, the one thing that had sustained her, that support was gone. But she was in the convent at this time, and she was very mature. They noticed that. And in fact, she was put in charge of the novices. Now, here was a girl at this time, 21, and put in charge of training the other novices. And all except one were older than she was. But anyway, that's her life went on, and various ups and downs and that. But one of the great moments in 95, which is this year, this year is kind of very significant in the life of St. Therese. She began to realize that there are wonderful people around, great, great saints, who have offered themselves to God as victims to his justice. So that's fine, she said, but it's not for me. And she loved, like Joan of Arc was her favorite, and the great missionaries and the great heroes, and said, it's wonderful, said, but I want to be a saint. And if God has put that desire in my heart, it must be achievable, because God has put it there. But how can I become a great saint when I'm not a great person? I'm an ordinary, everyday, 25-cent person. How can I become a great saint? And it's very interesting in all of this thing, this whole, what brought her to it. Do you remember in France, the revolution, the French Revolution? Well, there were pretty terrible atrocities connected with that. Like the Carmelite nuns were executed, many of them were. Bishops, churches were destroyed, churches were torn down, the goddess of reason was established in Notre Dame, and I mean terrible atrocities came out of it. And a feeling went among the people, that, like say the devout Catholics who hung on, that because of France has offered such terrible insults to God and to his majesty and to his justice, that a punishment must come on France. But that the only way to sustain that would be, or to hold back like the arm of God, was if you had these great souls that would offer themselves as victims to his justice. You know, they would offer themselves and kind of hold back the arm of God. And you find little elements of that around today. You know, some people are so upset, we say, over the abortion or prayer out of school, especially among, say, Protestant fundamentalists, that the prayer in the school issue, and many things like that. You know, as someone said, you know, like if God doesn't destroy San Francisco, he owes an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, that kind of thinking. And you know that God's going to destroy America and all this. But at St. Therese's time, that was very strong. You know, and she read about souls who'd offered themselves. One of the nuns who founded the Carmelite convent in Lisieux, so the two sisters founded it, and she offered herself as a victim to God's justice, you see, to save France. And shortly afterwards, she had a mental breakdown. And for 33 years, she was in the convent, in that state. And they all felt, well, she'd offered herself and God had accepted it as a victim. St. Therese felt that's fine for those people, but there's something that just does not gel with me at all. And then one day it just dawned on her that no one offers themselves as a victim, sense of, you know, total consecration to God's loving mercy. And she decided then to offer herself. You see, it's a response to God's merciful love by a total response of her love for God. And she made that act. And a whole new sense of security and confidence and trust comes into her life. You know, as she realizes, you see, that her response is a response to God's mercy. See, and mercy means you recognize someone's weakness. But out of your love, you still love that person, and you even love them in their weakness, and you do something to help that person. You know, being merciful is not just something vague, it's practical. But it's recognizing the truth of weakness and of need, and then reaching out. So from that she began to realize, so what if I'm weak? So what if I'm an ordinary soul? And she tried a few penances, remember, like a cross with spikes, and it just tore her chest and began to fester. She said, oh, that's not for me. And so all those fancy things, you know, the penances and the asceticism, a lot of those they're not for me. I am not strong enough for those. See, but she recognized the strength of those people for whom they were the way. See, again, that marvelous balance within her, but it's not for me. Then gradually she began to realize, gee, I'm like most people in the world. And that's when she began to discover that her way could help many others, you see. And beginning with the novices and then the priests she used to write to and so on. But anyway, during this 95, which says this is the centenary year, her sister, who was prioress, asked her to write her stories, her memories of her childhood. One day at recreation, they were all gathered, and she was telling stories. She was a great storyteller and a great mimic. And she was telling stories and mimicking and all this. And so the prior said, write that down. And she didn't want to. She said it was a waste of time, I'm telling you. So she wrote it down. And that's the first part of her autobiography. One of the great classics, of spiritual literature. Then in 96, like next year, during Lent, see now, during this particular year she wasn't well. Like she was coughing and her throat was sore a lot of times. But in 96, on Holy Thursday, when she went to bed, she could feel something in her mouth. She wasn't sure what it was. It was a stream, a hot stream. And in the morning she looked and it was blood. It was coughing blood. What do you call it? Hemoptysis? The what? Hemoptysis. Yeah, that's what. It was tuberculosis. The lungs were going. And, but that happened. But then, 2 nights later, was Easter Sunday. Suddenly, darkness enveloped her spiritually. And remember I mentioned, like with her father, the one thing that kept her going was her belief in heaven. And now she said that it was like a wall came down between heaven and myself. She said it was like being in a tunnel. There was neither hot nor cold. And there was no light. And I have a photo I left there. When you're in Lisieux, when you're going out of Lisieux or coming into it, whichever way, you have to go through long railway tunnels. And then remember, she had been went through the St. Goddard Pass on her way to Rome, big long tunnel through the Alps. But I was in one of those tunnels, the one going into Lisieux, and it's quite long. And you wonder, but she'd experienced that, but that's the way she began to experience what she was going through. It was darkness, there was no light. She also described like as a fog that has descended. But someone has told you that there is a beautiful countryside out there, and you just have to take it on their word. And she's struggling. She looked out the window and there was like down through the trees, there was like a black hole, where you couldn't see anything. She said, that's what my soul is like. Now, all during this time then, right until she died, she said that, that this terrible wall has come down, the fog, the darkness, the tunnel. I said, and I'll be in it till God deigns to lift it. And he hasn't lifted it yet. And actually, that was her state right up to her death. Right to the very end. During all this time, you see, of this darkness, this terrible darkness, and struggles against faith, she wrote out in blood the creed, so that even though she couldn't form words, she mentions that, or even thoughts, she said the creed. And in fact, she wrote out in her blood and kept it in her little gospel that she always kept in her pocket. She scratched in her room, her cell, Jesus, my only love. She had to be making those acts of will, those struggles. And in fact, she said to one nun, said, I don't believe in heaven. I can only love. So for her, that love and trust and faith are all one. And when she couldn't kind of think, and when the temptations were there against faith and so on, she made acts of love and acts of confidence and acts of trust in God. See, and whenever you make an act of faith, hope, or love, whichever, in making one, you're strengthening the other two. And it was like true confidence in God. Even if he kills me, I still will trust him. And acts of love of God and of her companions, of her neighbor. And that love that was stretching out, you see, out now to not only to France, but now to Africa, because one of her missionary priests was there. Or no, that was China. And the young seminarian she was praying for was going to go to Africa. It's widening all the time. But the terrible, she could never understand it. But she got guidance from St. John of the Cross, because he described for her what she was going through. So she knew that it wasn't. She said at one time, I'm afraid to write more in case I blaspheme. She said, I may have said too much already. See, but Therese has that tremendous sense of truth. Whatever she was experiencing, or whatever she was going through, that was it. There was no pretense. She's a woman of great truth. But St. John was guiding her. In other words, she didn't panic, because she knew here was someone who had gone through it and who had described it. And he was kind of the one that, you might say, almost kept her sanity during all that. She always loved St. John of the Cross. But she went through the terrible darkness of faith. And at the same time, her body was disintegrating. One lung went, and then a third of the lung, and then a half of the lung. And then she was getting bed sores and pains, in the ribs. And then the tuberculosis went into the intestines, and her stomach was hard as a rock, and then enema after one or the other. And the whole suffering and the pain and the thirst. I mean, really, that long period, especially the last about 8 months, it's pretty horrendous reading. And, she's getting weaker and weaker, and been up all night with insomnia and the perspiration, all of those stuff. And in all of this, there's the terrible darkness. And yet she's reaching out. And what she makes very clear is that she's in great peace, you see, because of her trust in God. She knows that God loves her, and she trusts in his love for her. And she becomes very identified with Christ in his passion. But it always becomes very clear that she's not looking for suffering. She said one time she tried it. She asked God to give her some suffering, and she got it, and she couldn't handle it. She said, that's the last time I'm going to ask for it. She said, I'm not strong enough for suffering. But if God sends it to me, then he has to give me the shoulder to carry it. He has to give me the strength, you see. What she was asking for was to be like the one she loved. You see, whatever suffering came, that was up to God. And she trusted that it was out of his love. So she didn't know, she couldn't explain it, but she trusted in that.